The easiest way to lose respect is to judge a stranger before learning their story. The afternoon sun hung high above Savannah, Georgia, casting long reflections across the polished windows of downtown buildings, while people hurried along wide sidewalks carrying shopping bags, coffee cups, and conversations that seemed far more important than the strangers walking beside them. Street musicians filled the warm air with soft melodies. Children laughed near a small fountain in the city square, and tourists paused every few yards to capture photographs of the historic streets. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary until one quiet man stepped out of a veterans' charity luncheon, wearing simple civilian clothes that gave no hint of the extraordinary life he had lived. Marcus Bennett walked at an unhurried pace, dressed in a charcoal button-down shirt, dark jeans, and worn brown boots that had traveled farther than anyone passing him could imagine. His posture was straight without being rigid, his expression calm without appearing distant, and every movement reflected years of discipline that had become second nature rather than something he consciously displayed. Around his wrist rested a modest watch, while a folded envelope from the charity event remained tucked beneath his arm. He nodded politely to an elderly couple crossing the street and paused for a moment to help a young mother retrieve a toy that had rolled toward the curb. To everyone watching, he was simply another courteous man enjoying a peaceful afternoon. Yet appearances have always been dangerous when people mistake simplicity for weakness. Across the street, Officer Daniel Brooks sat inside his patrol vehicle completing routine paperwork before beginning another patrol through the downtown district. He had served with the department for nearly 14 years and believed experience had taught him how to recognize suspicious behavior within seconds. As he looked up from his computer screen, his attention settled on Marcus almost immediately. The officer watched him from behind the windshield for several moments, studying every movement through the narrow lens of assumption instead of observation. Marcus continued walking toward a public plaza where several city workers were setting up chairs for an evening community concert. He glanced briefly toward a bronze military memorial standing near the courthouse entrance, his eyes lingering on the engraved names before offering a quiet smile that carried memories no one around him could understand. Officer Brooks stepped from his cruiser and adjusted his duty belt before calling out firmly across the sidewalk. Several nearby pedestrians slowed their pace. A pair of college students stopped talking. A food vendor looked up from arranging bottled water inside a cooler. The ordinary rhythm of the afternoon quietly shifted as curious attention gathered around a conversation that had not even begun. Marcus stopped immediately and turned with complete composure, meeting the officer's eyes without hesitation or hostility. "Good afternoon, officer," he said in a steady voice. "How can I help you?" His calm response seemed almost unexpected. Brooks approached with measured confidence, asking for identification while explaining that he needed to verify a few things. Marcus politely reached toward his wallet only after acknowledging the request, moving carefully and deliberately. The growing crowd exchanged uncertain glances, sensing tension without understanding its source. No raised voices echoed through the plaza. No dramatic confrontation unfolded. Instead, there was something almost heavier than anger settling into the warm Georgia air. It was the quiet weight of assumptions being formed before facts had the chance to speak. Somewhere in the distance, church bells marked the passing hour while a gentle breeze carried the sound across the square. None of the people watching realized they were standing at the beginning of a moment that would soon force an entire community to reconsider what authority looked like, what dignity truly meant, and how easily a uniform could become louder than the truth waiting patiently behind ordinary clothes. Marcus Bennett slowly removed his wallet from his back pocket exactly as Officer Daniel Brooks had instructed, never making a sudden movement and never allowing frustration to change the calm expression on his face. Years of military service had taught him that composure often revealed more strength than the loudest argument ever could. He handed over his driver's license without hesitation, maintaining steady eye contact while speaking with quiet respect. "Take your time, officer," he said evenly. "If there is a misunderstanding, I am sure we can clear it up." Instead of easing the growing tension, Marcus's confidence seemed to deepen Brooks's suspicion. The officer glanced at the identification card only briefly before looking back at the man standing in front of him. Something about Marcus's steady posture, measured breathing, and complete lack of anxiety did not fit the assumptions Brooks had already formed. Around them, more pedestrians slowed their pace. Several people standing outside a nearby coffee shop quietly watched while pretending to continue their conversations. A delivery driver paused beside his truck. Two tourists lowered their cameras, sensing that something unusual was unfolding in the middle of an otherwise peaceful afternoon. Marcus remained perfectly still. His shoulders were relaxed, his hands visible, and his voice never rose above a normal conversational tone. It was the kind of self-control earned through decades of responsibility rather than personality alone. Every small movement reflected discipline. He waited patiently instead of interrupting. He listened before answering. Even the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other carried the balance of someone accustomed to standing through long ceremonies, inspections, and difficult conversations. Brooks studied him carefully. "What brings you downtown today?" he asked. Marcus smiled politely. "I attended a veterans charity luncheon a few blocks away. I am heading back after visiting the memorial." He gently nodded toward the bronze monument visible across the plaza. The answer was simple, direct, and completely ordinary. Yet Brooks continued examining him as though searching for something hidden beneath every word. A younger patrol officer approached after noticing the growing crowd. "Everything all right here?" he asked quietly. Brooks answered, without taking his eyes off Marcus. "Routine investigation." The younger officer glanced briefly at Marcus and immediately noticed something difficult to explain. There was no fear in the man's face. There was no anger either. Only patience. It reminded him of senior military officers he had occasionally encountered during community events, people whose confidence came from experience rather than pride. Before he could say anything else, Brooks continued asking additional questions. Marcus answered each one clearly, never speaking faster than necessary. Imagine standing there while strangers quietly watched every word you spoke, already deciding who you were before learning anything about you. Many people would become defensive. Others might argue. Marcus didn't either. He understood that character was often measured most honestly when nobody believed you deserved the benefit of the doubt. A soft breeze carried the sound of distant church bells across the square as the afternoon sun reflected from nearby office windows. An elderly veteran sitting alone near the memorial observed Marcus with thoughtful curiosity. Something about the man's bearing looked familiar, though he could not immediately place it. Meanwhile, Brooks requested another identification check through dispatch, convinced there had to be more to the story than appeared on the surface. Marcus simply waited, his eyes briefly resting on the engraved names carved into the memorial stone. Behind those quiet eyes lived memories of soldiers who had never returned home, responsibilities that had shaped entire generations of service members, and promises that no civilian clothing could ever erase. Yet to everyone surrounding the plaza, he remained nothing more than an ordinary black man, patiently waiting while another assumption quietly grew heavier than the truth. Officer Daniel Brooks lowered the radio microphone from his shoulder after requesting additional verification, his attention never leaving Marcus Bennett for more than a second. The dispatcher acknowledged the request, but the response would take a few minutes because several routine calls were already being processed throughout the city. Those few minutes felt unusually long as the quiet circle of curious onlookers continued to grow. A local newspaper photographer walking toward the courthouse slowed his pace, sensing that something important was unfolding even though nobody had raised a voice. Across the sidewalk, two construction workers paused beside their truck, exchanging uncertain glances while trying to understand why a calm conversation carried so much invisible weight. Marcus remained exactly where he had been asked to stand. His breathing stayed steady, his shoulders relaxed, and his expression reflected patience instead of resentment. He had spent an entire career making difficult decisions under pressure, and he knew that emotional reactions often distracted people from the truth. Officer Brooks interpreted that composure differently. To him, Marcus seemed almost too comfortable, as though confidence itself deserved suspicion. "Have you served in the military?" Brooks suddenly asked after noticing the straight posture that never seemed to fade. Marcus answered with the same respectful tone. "Yes, officer. I have served my country for many years." Brooks nodded without asking another question about that service. Instead, he focused on details that supported the conclusion he had already reached in his own mind. Confirmation bias quietly replaced objective observation, and every ordinary answer appeared unusual simply because he expected it to be. Nearby, the younger patrol officer shifted uneasily. He quietly leaned closer to Brooks and said, "His identification appears valid. Maybe dispatch will clear everything up." Brooks answered without lowering his voice, "We will wait until I know exactly who we are dealing with." Marcus heard every word but showed no sign of offense. He understood that respect for authority did not require surrendering personal dignity. He simply folded his hands in front of him and waited. Imagine standing peacefully in the middle of a public square while strangers silently decided your character based only on appearances. Some faces reflected sympathy. Others reflected uncertainty. A few quietly accepted the officer's assumptions because uniforms often carry automatic credibility. Yet none of them knew the years of sacrifice standing only a few feet away. An elderly veteran slowly rose from the bench beside the memorial and walked a little closer. His eyes studied Marcus carefully before resting on the challenge coin clipped discreetly inside the man's wallet, barely visible when the identification had been removed earlier. The veteran frowned thoughtfully. There was something familiar about that coin, something he remembered seeing during joint military ceremonies years before. Before he could speak, Brooks received another transmission through his radio. The dispatcher confirmed that the driver's license was authentic and active. There were no outstanding warrants, no criminal alerts, and no indication of illegal activity. The information should have settled the situation, yet Brooks remained unconvinced. "Stay right here," he instructed firmly. Marcus answered with a calm nod. "I have no intention of leaving." Several members of the crowd exchanged puzzled looks. If the identification was valid and nothing unlawful had been reported, why was the conversation continuing? Even the younger officer found himself quietly questioning the direction of the encounter. High above the square, an American flag moved gently in the afternoon breeze while church bells echoed once again through the historic district. Far from the courthouse, inside a secure military installation nearly 20 miles away, a scheduled strategic briefing was about to begin. Officers gathered around a conference table noticed one chair remained empty. It belonged to General Marcus Bennett. At first, nobody seemed concerned. The general had always been punctual. But as another minute passed without his arrival or communication, several experienced officers exchanged uneasy glances. They knew one simple truth that nobody standing in the Savannah Plaza could possibly imagine. General Marcus Bennett never missed a briefing without a reason. Inside the secure conference room at Fort Stewart, the digital clock quietly advanced another minute, while senior officers remained seated around a polished oak table covered with operational folders, regional maps, and encrypted communication tablets. Conversations that normally began precisely on schedule had given way to thoughtful silence. Every officer in the room understood General Marcus Bennett's reputation better than anyone outside those walls ever could. He was never late without explanation. He was never careless with time. Most importantly, he never ignored a scheduled briefing involving national readiness. Colonel Rebecca Hayes looked toward the empty chair reserved for Marcus and felt a quiet sense of concern settle across the room. She reviewed the morning schedule one more time before speaking calmly. "Has anyone received an update from the general?" Around the table, several officers exchanged brief glances before quietly shaking their heads. One communications specialist checked the secure message system again. Another confirmed that Marcus had departed the Veterans Charity Luncheon exactly as planned. Every detail matched the schedule until his expected arrival simply stopped. Rebecca stood and walked toward the large display screen showing the day's itinerary. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet years of military leadership had taught her that discipline also meant recognizing the smallest irregularity before it became a larger problem. "Contact his security liaison," she instructed. "Verify his last confirmed location." Within seconds, calls began moving through official channels. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away in downtown Savannah, Marcus remained standing peacefully beside the courthouse plaza while Officer Daniel Brooks continued asking measured but increasingly repetitive questions. The crowd had grown larger without becoming disruptive. Several people quietly recorded the encounter on their phones, not because anyone was shouting, but because something about the scene felt deeply uncomfortable. The younger patrol officer noticed the growing attention and spoke softly once more. "Sir," dispatch confirmed his identification. "Perhaps we should conclude the stop." Brooks folded his arms and looked toward Marcus again. "Something does not add up," he replied. Marcus answered with remarkable patience. "Officer, if there is additional information you need, I will cooperate. I only ask that conclusions follow facts." His words carried no accusation. They carried experience. Imagine standing before strangers who had already decided what kind of person you were simply because your appearance matched someone else's assumptions. The hardest battle is often remaining calm when dignity is quietly being tested. Marcus understood that truth rarely needed to rush. Back inside the military base, the communications officer finally looked up from the secure terminal. "Colonel, his government phone has not checked into the military network since he left the luncheon." Rebecca's expression remained controlled, but her eyes sharpened with immediate focus. "Last civilian location?" she asked. The answer appeared seconds later after coordinating with authorized tracking procedures connected to official travel. Downtown Savannah, near the courthouse district. Rebecca reached for her service cap without hesitation. "Prepare a vehicle. I am going personally." No panic entered her voice. No dramatic orders echoed through the room. Professionalism replaced uncertainty with action. Officers stood immediately, recognizing the seriousness behind the colonel's calm tone. Outside the base, engines quietly started as a small convoy prepared to leave. None of the soldiers viewed the mission as extraordinary because protecting the chain of command was simply part of their duty. At that exact moment, the elderly veteran near the memorial finally stepped closer to Marcus. He looked carefully at the challenge coin still partially visible inside the wallet before slowly raising his eyes. His face changed almost instantly, not with fear, but with recognition. He opened his mouth as though about to say something important, then paused after noticing Officer Brooks still watching Marcus with unwavering suspicion. Across the plaza, the first military vehicle had already entered the highway, moving steadily toward the city while the afternoon sun slowly drifted westward, carrying with it the quiet certainty that the truth was now on its way. The afternoon traffic moved steadily through Savannah as the military convoy covered the distance from Fort Stewart with quiet precision, attracting little attention beyond the occasional passing driver. Inside the lead vehicle, Colonel Rebecca Hayes sat reviewing the information collected during the past several minutes. Every report confirmed the same sequence. General Marcus Bennett had attended the Veterans Charity Luncheon exactly as scheduled. He had left alone because he preferred traveling without unnecessary ceremony whenever official security requirements allowed it. His final confirmed location placed him near the courthouse district before all routine communication unexpectedly stopped. Rebecca closed the digital tablet and looked through the windshield. She knew Marcus well enough to understand that silence from him was never carelessness. If he had not checked in, something unusual had interrupted an otherwise ordinary afternoon. Back in the city square, Marcus continued standing patiently, while Officer Daniel Brooks remained convinced that additional questioning was justified. The atmosphere had changed without anyone speaking louder than before. More people quietly gathered along the sidewalks. Some watched from cafe windows while others paused beside parked bicycles or shaded benches. The curiosity was no longer about whether something had happened. It was about why nothing seemed to be changing despite every official verification pointing toward the same conclusion. The younger patrol officer stepped beside Brooks once again. "Sir, dispatch has confirmed everything they can confirm through civilian records," he said carefully. "Perhaps we should conclude the stop." Brooks folded the identification card before handing it back to Marcus. "Not yet," he answered. "There are still questions." Marcus accepted the wallet with a polite nod and returned it to his pocket without displaying the slightest irritation. "Officer," he said calmly, "every professional has a responsibility to verify facts. I respect that responsibility. I simply hope the same standard applies to every citizen." His words settled over the crowd more heavily than any accusation could have. Imagine standing in front of complete strangers, knowing your reputation has been earned over decades, while also knowing none of those accomplishments can speak for you in the present moment. Marcus understood that true character was revealed when titles disappeared and only integrity remained. Nearby, the elderly veteran finally gathered enough confidence to approach another step closer. He studied Marcus's face once more before quietly asking, "Sir, have we met during Armed Forces Day ceremonies at Fort Stewart?" Marcus smiled warmly. "It is possible. I have attended many over the years." Before the conversation could continue, the distant sound of approaching engines drifted across the downtown streets. Several members of the crowd instinctively turned toward the avenue leading to the courthouse. One military vehicle appeared first, followed by another, both moving with calm purpose rather than urgency. They parked neatly along the curb without lights or sirens, drawing immediate attention from everyone nearby. Uniformed service members stepped out with disciplined composure, scanning the area before opening the rear passenger door of the lead vehicle. Colonel Rebecca Hayes emerged wearing her service uniform with quiet confidence, her expression professional and focused. She did not rush forward. She did not raise her voice. She simply surveyed the scene until her eyes found Marcus standing peacefully beside Officer Brooks. For the first time that afternoon, genuine uncertainty crossed Brooks's face as he noticed every soldier instinctively directing respectful attention toward the same man he had continued questioning. Without saying a single unnecessary word, Rebecca began walking across the plaza, each measured step bringing the quiet truth closer to everyone who had spent the last hour judging an ordinary man whose greatest strength had never been visible in the clothes he chose to wear. Colonel Rebecca Hayes crossed the courthouse plaza with measured confidence, her polished boots echoing softly against the stone walkway as every member of the military detail followed several respectful steps behind. No one hurried. No one issued dramatic commands. Their quiet professionalism spoke louder than any display of authority ever could. Conversations throughout the square slowly faded until the only sounds remaining were distant traffic, the gentle movement of the American flag above the courthouse, and the steady rhythm of footsteps drawing closer to Marcus Bennett. Officer Daniel Brooks instinctively straightened his posture as the colonel approached, uncertain whether the arriving officers were responding to his investigation or something entirely different. The younger patrol officer silently observed the military personnel greeting one another with disciplined precision, recognizing immediately that these were not ordinary visitors. Marcus remained exactly where he had been standing from the beginning, his expression unchanged, his hands relaxed at his sides, and his attention focused calmly on the people approaching him. Rebecca stopped a few feet away before offering a respectful salute reserved for official military protocol. In a clear, composed voice that carried naturally across the silent plaza, she said, "Good afternoon, General Bennett. Headquarters has been awaiting your arrival for the strategic readiness briefing. When your scheduled communication did not arrive, we came to ensure everything was all right." For a brief moment, the entire square seemed to stop breathing. The crowd looked from Rebecca to Marcus and then back again, trying to process the simple sentence they had just heard. The elderly veteran slowly lowered his head with quiet understanding, finally recognizing the man he believed he had seen years earlier during military ceremonies. Several people holding mobile phones exchanged astonished glances as whispers spread through the gathering. "General." The single word traveled through the crowd with remarkable speed, replacing every earlier assumption with disbelief. Brooks looked directly at Marcus, then toward Colonel Hayes, searching for some sign that he had misunderstood. Rebecca calmly removed a leather credential holder from her pocket and presented official military identification confirming her command position. There was no anger in her voice, only quiet professionalism. "General Bennett has served this country with distinction for decades," she continued. He was traveling in civilian attire following an approved public event before returning to the installation. Brooks felt the certainty he had carried all afternoon begin to disappear beneath the weight of verified facts. He realized that every conclusion he had reached had been built upon appearance instead of evidence. Marcus accepted neither satisfaction nor triumph from the revelation. Instead, he offered Brooks the same respectful expression he had maintained since the first conversation. "Officer," he said gently, "a uniform deserves respect, but every citizen deserves fairness before conclusions are reached." His words carried no bitterness. They carried experience earned through years of leading thousands of service members from every background imaginable. Imagine discovering that the person you quietly judged by clothing alone had spent a lifetime protecting the freedoms that allowed every person standing in that square to speak, question, disagree, and live without fear. The lesson reached far beyond one encounter. It challenged every witness to reconsider how quickly assumptions could replace truth. Colonel Hayes turned toward Marcus with a slight nod. "General, whenever you are ready, the briefing team is prepared." Marcus smiled warmly before looking once more at the courthouse memorial where countless names honored those who had served without seeking recognition. Then he faced Brooks again with calm dignity, knowing that the most important victory that afternoon was not the revelation of rank, but the opportunity for understanding to begin where prejudice had once stood. Officer Daniel Brooks lowered his eyes for the first time since the encounter had begun, the confidence that had guided every earlier decision now replaced by quiet reflection. Around him, the gathering crowd slowly shifted from curiosity to thoughtful silence as the truth settled over the courthouse plaza. Nobody celebrated another person's mistake. Nobody cheered the unexpected revelation. Instead, there was a shared recognition that every assumption made that afternoon had carried consequences far beyond a routine conversation. Colonel Rebecca Hayes remained composed beside General Marcus Bennett, allowing the facts to speak for themselves rather than adding unnecessary words. The younger patrol officer took one careful step forward and respectfully addressed the general. "Sir, I apologize that this situation lasted longer than it should have." Marcus acknowledged him with a warm nod. "Professionalism begins with the willingness to learn," he replied. "That willingness matters more than perfection." Those standing nearby quietly absorbed every word. The elderly veteran removed his cap and placed it over his heart for a brief moment before approaching Marcus. "General," he said with genuine admiration, "I knew I recognized your bearing. I attended one of your leadership ceremonies years ago. Thank you for your service." Marcus smiled humbly. "Thank you for yours as well." There was no sense of superiority in his voice. His years of command had taught him that respect was strongest when it flowed in both directions. Officer Brooks finally looked directly at Marcus again. The calm man standing before him had not changed from the beginning of the encounter. His clothing was the same. His posture was the same. His words had remained respectful from the first greeting until this very moment. The only thing that had changed was the information Brooks possessed. That realization weighed heavily on him. Imagine discovering that nothing about another person had changed except your understanding of who they truly were. Sometimes the greatest correction does not happen in front of your eyes. It happens inside your own mind. Brooks took a slow breath before speaking carefully. "General Bennett, I recognize that I should have allowed verified facts to guide my judgment. I appreciate your patience throughout this encounter." Marcus answered without hesitation. "Officer, every profession depends on trust. Trust grows when people are willing to examine their own decisions honestly." The statement carried neither condemnation nor triumph. It sounded more like a lesson shared by a mentor than a victory claimed over an opponent. Colonel Hayes observed the exchange with quiet approval. She had served alongside Marcus long enough to know that his greatest strength had never been found in rank or authority. It was found in the consistency of his character, whether he wore decorated military dress, combat equipment, or ordinary civilian clothing. Members of the crowd slowly returned to their afternoon routines, but many left carrying something more valuable than an unexpected story. Parents quietly spoke to their children. Friends continued conversations that now centered on fairness instead of speculation. Even the newspaper photographer lowered his camera for a moment, realizing the most important image from the afternoon could never be captured by a single photograph. As the military detail prepared to depart, the courthouse bell echoed across the square once again. General Marcus Bennett looked briefly toward the memorial honoring generations of service members before walking beside Colonel Hayes toward the waiting vehicles. Behind them, Officer Brooks remained standing in thoughtful silence, understanding that real accountability begins long before any formal review. It begins the moment a person accepts that character should always be measured by truth rather than appearance. And that lesson would remain with him long after the plaza had become quiet once again. The convoy departed the courthouse with quiet dignity, leaving behind a city square that looked exactly as it had an hour earlier, yet somehow felt completely different. The afternoon sunlight still reflected from the historic buildings. The fountain continued sending gentle streams into the air, and the sounds of ordinary life gradually returned. But for everyone who had witnessed the encounter, ordinary no longer meant the same thing. Back at the Savannah Police Department, Officer Daniel Brooks completed the required incident report with unusual care. Every sentence received more attention than it might have on any other day. Facts replaced assumptions. Timelines replaced impressions. For the first time in many years, Brooks found himself reviewing not only what had happened, but why he had interpreted the situation the way he had. Across the hallway, the younger patrol officer quietly entered the report room carrying a cup of coffee. He paused before speaking. Today taught me something I will not forget. Brooks nodded slowly. It taught me something as well. Neither man tried to defend the decisions that had prolonged the encounter. Instead, they discussed the importance of allowing verified information to guide professional judgment before personal impressions could take over. Their conversation was calm, honest, and free from excuses. Meanwhile, General Marcus Bennett arrived at Fort Stewart with Colonel Rebecca Hayes just minutes before the strategic readiness briefing officially began. Senior officers stood as he entered the conference room, offering respectful greetings before immediately returning to the business of serving the nation. Marcus acknowledged every salute with quiet humility before taking his seat at the head of the table. There was no mention of the courthouse. There was no public complaint. The mission before them remained more important than personal recognition. During a brief pause in the meeting, Colonel Hayes quietly asked, "General, would you like me to notify the appropriate civilian authorities regarding today's events?" Marcus considered the question for several thoughtful seconds before answering. "Professional accountability should always follow established procedures," he replied. "My concern is not personal embarrassment. My concern is whether everyone receives the same fairness, regardless of appearance, occupation, or background." His words reflected the leadership philosophy that had guided him throughout his military career. Imagine carrying enough authority to demand immediate consequences, yet choosing instead to strengthen the system rather than satisfy personal pride. That is the difference between power and leadership. One seeks control, the other seeks improvement. Later that evening, department leadership reviewed the body camera recordings together with dispatch records and witness statements. The video revealed exactly what the crowd had witnessed. Marcus had remained respectful from beginning to end. His identification had been verified early in the encounter. The continued delay had resulted not from missing evidence, but from conclusions formed before the available facts had been fully accepted. Supervisors quietly discussed additional training emphasizing procedural fairness, objective decision-making, and communication during public encounters. The purpose was not humiliation. It was improvement. Across town, Marcus stood alone for a few quiet moments outside his office as the evening sky turned shades of gold and deep blue above the base. Young soldiers walked nearby, laughing after another successful day of training, unaware that their commanding general had just demonstrated one of the most important lessons leadership could ever teach. Respect is never measured by rank alone. It is measured by how a person treats others when no title, medal, or uniform is visible. As darkness slowly settled across Georgia, both Marcus Bennett and Daniel Brooks ended the day carrying different responsibilities than they had that morning. One continued leading through quiet example. The other began learning that true professionalism starts not with authority, but with the courage to question one's own assumptions before judging another human being. Several weeks passed before the memory of that afternoon finally settled into something greater than a single public encounter. News of the incident quietly circulated through professional circles, not because anyone had sought attention, but because the story carried an important lesson about judgment, responsibility, and the value of treating every person with equal dignity. At Fort Stewart, General Marcus Bennett stood before a group of newly commissioned officers gathered inside a bright leadership auditorium overlooking the parade field. Morning sunlight streamed through tall windows as rows of young service members listened carefully, notebooks resting on their laps, eager to learn from decades of experience that no textbook could fully capture. Marcus looked across the room with the same calm expression that had never left him, whether standing before soldiers, community leaders, or strangers on a city sidewalk. "Every uniform represents responsibility," he began. But responsibility begins long before anyone earns a title. It begins with the decision to see people clearly before deciding who they are. The room remained completely silent. Every officer understood that they were hearing more than leadership principles. They were hearing the quiet foundation upon which trust is built. Marcus continued by reminding them that courage is not always demonstrated during moments of crisis. Sometimes courage appears in the willingness to pause, verify facts, and recognize the humanity of the person standing in front of you. Across Savannah, Officer Daniel Brooks had also changed in ways that were less visible but equally important. During departmental training sessions, he openly discussed the encounter with newer officers, not to defend his choices, but to explain how easily confidence can become assumption when professionalism is no longer guided by evidence. His honesty surprised many colleagues. Rather than protecting his pride, he chose to strengthen the department by sharing the lesson he had learned. The younger patrol officer who had quietly questioned the situation that afternoon often reflected on Marcus's patience. He realized that calm leadership could influence people far more deeply than anger ever could. Imagine discovering that one ordinary afternoon can quietly reshape the way an entire group of people approaches every future encounter. That is how meaningful change often begins. Not through dramatic speeches or public victories, but through ordinary people deciding to become a little more thoughtful than they were the day before. Months later, Marcus returned to the same courthouse plaza for another veterans charity event. The fountain continued flowing peacefully. Children once again laughed beneath the shade trees, and visitors admired the historic streets just as they always had. This time, however, several community members recognized him and greeted him warmly, not because of his military rank, but because they remembered his patience, humility, and quiet strength. Nearby, Officer Brooks happened to be assigned to the same district. He noticed Marcus from across the square and walked over with genuine respect. The two men shook hands briefly. No lengthy conversation was necessary. Mutual understanding had already replaced misunderstanding. Marcus wished him a safe shift. Brooks thanked him for the example he had set. As they walked in separate directions, the bronze memorial reflected the afternoon sunlight, reminding every passerby that true service is measured not only by medals or uniforms, but by character displayed when nobody knows who you are. Some people spend their lives trying to prove their importance. Others quietly demonstrate it through every decision they make. On that afternoon in Savannah, the greatest victory did not belong to rank, authority, or public recognition. It belonged to truth, humility, and the simple reminder that justice begins the moment we choose to see the person before the appearance. Because the strongest leaders never ask to be judged by their titles. They ask to be judged by their character, and character will always outlast prejudice.